I'll introduce myself first. My name is Greg Genega. I work in innovation at KPMG. I'm primarily focused on all things Web3, digital assets, blockchain, metaverse, et cetera. 7 years roughly in the space. Wrote a lot of articles on DeFi. I run my own home Ethereum validator node, and I help the firm with everything that I possibly can in the realm of blockchain. So I will let our two distinguished guests introduce themselves. Yorke?
Yorke Rhodes from Microsoft. More famously, I guess I co-founded our blockchain work in 2015, really starting in the public crypto space, primarily Ethereum. And so in that context, I do a lot of advice across the company. It's 24 divisions, very conservative organization. So cajoling activity is a very lengthy process, as anyone who works in an enterprise knows. But in my day job, I actually run a supply chain blockchain-based traceability and financial controls program that sits in our cloud supply chain, and so it's one of the highest scale, high-tech supply chains in the world, and we're seeing phenomenal success from that program, so it's a great use case. Cool. Oh, by the way, sorry, really quickly, Ethereum, the merge, which happened last fall, actually was a move to proof of stake, so it was correct first time on the slide, so we can talk about that later as well.
Irreversible. I think everyone already knows me. The one thing I would add is just that for the last year and a half, I've been building a company called Kresus, which is predicated on the idea that we were talking about Web3, Web 1, Web 2. The key tools were the browser or the search window. Web 3, the key tool really is the wallet. It's the way in. It's what people use. And the current sort of ecosystem of wallets, I like to joke, is sort of like mushrooms that grew after a heavy rain. They all sort of sprouted up at once, often for very esoteric or limited reasons. And so there's a need, I think, for a next generation wallet tool that is all-encompassing and actually easy to use for normal people. And so Kresus is a B2B2C, so we have a business portal and a consumer product, which is at its heart a better wallet for the blockchain.
Excellent. So to frame this up, this is kind of like a fireside chat where we're just going to talk about all things with the state of Web3, blockchain, digital assets. We all work very, very much in that space. But so first we have to get it out of the way. You know, talking about this sector, 2022, a bit of a rough year for the digital asset sector. I saw a lot of regulation happening, or rather enforcement activity happening. But we look in 2023, and the headlines year to date, and really in the last week, are a complete 180. Last Friday, we had BlackRock, the largest asset manager in the world, file to create a Bitcoin spot ETF. Today, EDX Markets, a digital asset exchange, went live. That's backed by Fidelity, Charles Schwab, and Citadel. Also today, Deutsche Bank, one of the globally systemic important banks, they announced their intent with filing for a digital asset custodian license with Germany. So we see all of this happening. So I guess the question to ask here is crypto or digital assets, is it dead, or has the rumors of its death been greatly exaggerated? What are your guys' thoughts on it right now?
I think one of the interesting things about this point is that the market cycles that happen in the public blockchain space, which includes crypto, are much faster, right, than the typical market cycles that we have outside of the space, and that's largely because of the technology. It also enables larger implosions sometimes as well because of how fast the technology moves. But it's absolutely not dead. The nice thing about this space, and Scott mentioned this earlier, is it's an incredibly vibrant open source ecosystem that actually has a common frame of reference around value in the ecosystem, not value in a private company. And that's a very, very significant difference between what's going on here and why it's so interesting and fast versus what we've seen in a traditional, like, VC-backed, everything proprietary, everything private company space. So that's...
No, I would agree. I mean, I think there was a great deal of hype, as we all saw, but not really against the more fundamental elements of the blockchain. I mean, I think the most miraculous thing about the blockchain, and by the way, what a fascinating 45 minutes we just spent, but is the blockchain itself, the universal ledger. It's just such a game changer. I don't know that we've seen such a game changer really since perhaps the World Wide Web, and how profound the implications are. And I think it's very much like the early days of the World Wide Web, where if those of you who are old enough remember, was all this talk about it's credit card fraud and dark web, and there were a million reasons why no one was ever going to put their credit card on this World Wide Web thing. Fast forward a few years, ironically, I was at Microsoft during those days, and I remember all the skepticism, but now, of course, it's ubiquitous, and for the same reason, I think the universal ledger and smart contracts are so profound. Notwithstanding NFTs and other things that are also profound, it's going to change everything. And it's important to note, even last week, even in this climate, Sotheby's sold one NFT for more than $6 million. And there's still a there, although I will publicly acknowledge the perpetual or never-ending audit does terrify me. No offense to you.
I mean, it's a great question, because we've been doing audits on our internal work as well, and it's actually the ledger is a value case for audits, right? It helps answer a lot of questions that are hard to answer otherwise. So it is a value case, actually.
Excellent. So big part of my job is to provide insights to our many wonderful clients on everything that's new and fresh in the world of Web3. What are people thinking about? What are companies, businesses thinking about? Where are they applying Web3, or at least learning to apply Web3 in their business today? Overwhelmingly, I would say over the last, 6 to 8 months or so, there's two topics that seem to be a recurring theme in the Web3 space. One of those is the tokenization of real-world assets, and the other one is about NFTs and how brands can leverage NFTs to create loyalty mechanisms and other efficiencies, token gating, et cetera. So I wanted to get your thoughts on kind of these two sectors as well, since maybe there are some others in this audience here who might not be thinking of any of those things right now. Maybe there's some overlap in their business, maybe not, but maybe get an idea of what your thoughts are on these spaces and what you're thinking. So, starting with NFTs or non-fungible tokens. So we've seen so many headlines, LVMH, Starbucks, Nike, they're all diving headfirst into the NFT space. Where do you see the biggest area for growth and value for companies employing NFT technology into their business?
Well, I think actually helping to define what an NFT is versus a cryptocurrency is actually really important. And both are programmable assets, but typically a cryptocurrency carries one attribute, which is value, right? And so in other sessions I've done, I've called that very boring. It's obviously the characteristics of money, right? It has a very singular value. An NFT actually takes the programmable aspects and says, here's a base standard you can build upon, and then extend it in any way that you want. And this is really the power of this technology, and why we have seen brands jump in and start to utilize NFTs because of these specific sort of multi-attribute qualities associated with this thing that's programmable. And so, you also see an inflection point with the metaverse, and in particular the last couple of years with the pandemic and remote working, where brands have essentially lost the affinity or the loyalty, as well as the brand representation. Because if you sat on any Zoom session or Teams session, even when people have their video on, the brands have no representation on the screen, right? And so that's a very different experience for consumers and brands than physical world experience, where you see lots of logos and things like that. So it's a transitionary opportunity for brands to take what they know how to do in the physical space, which is merchandise physical goods with branding on them, and merchandise those goods in a digital context, and that's really what they're doing with NFTs in one very broad stroke way.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably people understand NFTs, but this concept, the non-fungible, it is verified, it is validated, et cetera. Again, such a powerful concept with so much applicability across almost any business or industry anyone here is in. We could point to multiple use cases where that is transformative. And for that reason, with Kresus, we allow everyone to mint. And we start with something very simple. You can just take a photo from your camera reel and you can mint that on the blockchain. We'll give you 5 copies. You can share it with your friends. And it goes back to that digital literacy. It's like, does anyone remember the first email they ever sent, right? What a milestone. And the reason why we're doing this is just to get people comfortable with the concept, because at Kresus, we believe soon you will mint your birth certificate, your passport, your driver's license, your medical power of attorney, your will, as well as tokenizing assets, et cetera. And if I get hit by an ambulance, would my wife know where the medical power of attorney that I signed is? Or could she show it to an ambulance driver or a hospital or a doctor? And wouldn't she need that, right? I mean, there are a million use cases where I think it's going to really transform our lives.
Yeah, and I was going to say, underlying this is the qualities of ledgers that Scott was talking about earlier, which is it's a digital record that's global. It transcends the boundaries of any sovereign state borders. It is not necessarily just one ledger, but it's built around a set of standards. The concept of things like NFTs is that it's a globally accessible digital object, which, to the point about fungibility or non-fungibility, actually allows you to define how many you can create or how many you can have, right? That's the non-fungible nature associated with it. And then, there's an implication. You mentioned wallets earlier. There's an implication about ownership, which actually has to do with identity. And identity was raised earlier as a question earlier, which I think is a good point to touch on as well. And I'll use a use case, for example. If you are living in a conflict zone where there might be regime change, would you rather that your identity was owned by the government in power, or would you rather that your identity was owned by yourself? Right? Just imagine the regime change risks associated with that. And that is the reason why self-sovereign identity is interesting, and it's why this ledger that creates uniqueness is interesting technology, particularly in the humanitarian sector as well.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it. And if I could add on to that, I think we take for granted, most of us living in the United States, that we have a very stable government, financial ecosystem, right? So when you see some people like, well, why do we need digital assets? Why do we need cryptocurrencies? Like, it's already digital. We're sending these to each other. We're using PayPal and Venmo. Like, this isn't really adding any value. But the example that you just mentioned, right, in these either emerging markets or troubled markets where maybe the financial system or the governments aren't so stable. So these decentralized blockchains, they create this way to have permissionless systems where all you need to do is basically generate a random number. You don't have to ask a government for ID. You don't have to ask a bank for an account. You just generate a random number on yourself. That is your private key, and that allows you to transact with value or with identity or with, and we'll go into the next question, other real-world assets or credentials that we can then tokenize. So, and tokenization has been definitely, I've talked more on tokenization than anything in the past month. People talking about this impacting $100 trillion market. So this is the concept of putting ownership rights of assets such as bond stocks, mortgages, titles, et cetera, onto a blockchain. So kind of the same question with the NFTs here. Where do you see some of the value propositions with using blockchains as rails for those types of assets and how that creates value and growth in that sector?
Well, I didn't talk about this before, but specific to NFTs, you can look at real-world, like analog use cases and think about Nike and department stores, right, versus the digital examples of that. So if you go into, say, Macy's in Herald Square, New York City, right, and you buy a Nike cap with a nice Nike logo on it, the first thing you're going to do after you're done shopping is you're going to walk outside of that store, right? And you take it with you, right? You effectively own that physical asset, right? And you can walk across the street into someone else's store, a different brand, and you bring that asset with you. This does not exist today in games. It does not exist in metaverses. They are essentially walled gardens where you're not really acquiring an asset. You are renting the opportunity to use that asset within the context of that walled garden. And so what brands like Nike see is this opportunity where I can sell someone a cap in one metaverse and have them be able to own that and take it with them in their wallet. because it's attached to their identity, and take it to other metaverses. And this is really where like Web3 and metaverse, I think, comes together very nicely, and where these rails actually help start to realize the digital world representation of what we think today are normal behaviors in an analog retail context.
But if you think about more broadly title, I mean, title was one of the most innovative elements of sort of Western civilization. But even today, you can actually only hold title to a car, a boat, a plane, or a house or piece of real estate. And that's quite limited. So, this watch I'm wearing, it has value, but if I were to sell it, I have to sell it with the box it came with, the little card from the manufacturer, the serial number, et cetera. Without those things, it's actually less valuable. If I listed it without them, I wouldn't get as much money for it, right? And so if the title to this watch were on the blockchain, that wouldn't be a worry of mine. And same with many other types of things. So I think it's almost inevitable these things will move to the blockchain, and what will happen is it will unlock all kinds of follow-on financial tools, right? So if I can prove I own this watch, and then why can't I divide it into 10 parts and sell those parts to other people who might think
Don't do that today.
Well, things like that, or maybe I can twin it, rent it out in the metaverse, insure that title, all kinds of other things that aren't really convenient today. And forget about a watch, maybe I'm buying a Picasso or a GIA certified diamond or many other things that have a lot of value we would all recognize, but don't currently come with title.
Yeah, I think that's a great point as well, which goes back to one of the core qualities of a blockchain ledger, which is provenance, right? The transactions which happen in a sequenced ledger that can't be changed give you historical data about an object, and that, the watch is a great example of that.
I actually think that pivots us into the question of AI, right? Of course, AI is a very big recurring theme here, and you mentioned the concept of provenance. So where do you see these two technologies melding? How does AI help Web3 and blockchain? How does blockchain and Web3 help AI? Where do you see this merging of the technologies, and again, how they enhance each other?
Well, yeah, I mean, AI helps everything, right? It's a utility which, clearly has broad applicability. In the inverse, and there's a reason why I brought up provenance, because I wanted to prompt that. Provenance is something that we know extremely well in the Web3 space. And the core problem with where we are with deepfakes and AI, as was talked about earlier, is provenance of data. How did you get to this implementation of this avatar or person that's showing up in a digital context and representing themselves as someone else? That's provenance, and that is what we understand really, really well from the Web3 space, and we're starting to see a lot of the concepts from Web3 bleed into how do you create data provenance. There's an interesting standard called C2PA.org, which is specifically a collaboration between Nikon, Canon, Adobe, Microsoft, and a couple of other institutions, specifically looking at signed-sealed content from cameras, as well as metadata associated with the content, so that you can have origin data about media. So it's great for journalists, obviously. And secondly, why is Adobe involved? Because Adobe is a tool which you use to transform media. So you need a historical metadata transformation associated with if you crop a picture or do something with it, to still know that that data has provenance associated with that original artifact. And so there's a ton of overlap that exists in this category.
Just, I think another word I would use for what you said as provenance is, validation, right? That validated data sets for these large language models will become, I think, a really important dynamic.
So unfortunately, we only have just under 2 minutes left, and I know that we could talk for hours on these topics. So in terms of any kind of final thoughts to leave everyone with here, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to flag one of the three of us down later. There's lots of other applications. There's B2B applications like a supply chain. There's kind of like the regulatory stance of the US and the digital asset ecosystem. Is there anything in particular you want to leave the audience with on anything blockchain related?
Satya, our CEO, has this really interesting quote that I like to chide him on, which is, Web3 needs its ChatGPT moment. I'm like, well, you spent $20 billion on the OpenAI partnership, so if you spend that much money on Web3, maybe we would have that moment as well. However, all of the AI announcements that we made, one of the most prominent terms that came up in those announcements over the last couple of weeks was actually provenance. And so there's a very clear recognition that this is a core problem that has to be solved in order for AI to not just devolve into this horrible dystopia that we all can envision.
Yeah, and I would just say for all of you with all your businesses, whatever they are, think through how will your business either be transformed or possibly disrupted, by this new series of technologies, or this new platform, because we see across the board, credit card companies moving transactions on the blockchain, ticketing companies doing tickets, loyalty points, rewards, supply chain, all of it, I think, is moving onto the blockchain for the obvious benefits, and it's coming soon to a theater near you.